In March of 2015, Jeremy Clarkson spent 20 minutes screaming at a colleague, then punched him in the face over a plate of cold meat. The BBC called it unforgivable. The tabloids called it the end. Within 3 weeks, he'd lost the biggest job in British television, and the two men who'd stood beside him for over a decade walked out the door right behind him. Everyone assumed that was the story. A man in his 50s, too famous for too long, finally undone by his own temper. They were wrong. That fracas in a Yorkshire hotel car park wasn't the end of anything. It was the opening scene of the strangest, slowest, most accidental image rebuild in modern British television. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Almost nobody involved, including Clarkson himself, seems to have planned a single step of it. Before we get into how a disgraced man became one of the most trusted voices in the country, hit subscribe. This channel unpacks the British stories that everyone thinks they know the ending to and finds the part that got left out of the headlines. This one has more left out than most. Let's start with what actually happened, because the popular version has softened over the years, and the real version is worse than most people remember. On the 4th of March 2015, after a long day filming Top Gear, Clarkson arrived at a hotel in North Yorkshire expecting a hot meal. There wasn't one. What followed, according to the BBC's own investigation, was 20 minutes of verbal abuse directed at producer Oisin Timon, loud enough to be heard in the dining room and in a bedroom upstairs, followed by a physical assault that lasted around 30 seconds and only stopped when someone else stepped in. Timon didn't fight back. He went to hospital with a split lip. The BBC's Director General didn't mince words. He said a line had been crossed, and that there couldn't be one rule for ordinary staff and another for a man who made the corporation a great deal of money. Within 3 weeks, Clarkson's contract was gone. James May and Richard Hammond, his co-presenters for over a decade, resigned in solidarity almost immediately. Top Gear, one of the most watched programs on the planet, lost its entire presenting lineup over a plate of meat and a man's temper. Here's the detail that tells you how divided the public actually was. Over 1 million people signed a petition demanding he be reinstated, not a modest number. 1 million people decided the sacking was the real injustice, while a producer sat at home with a split lip and, by all accounts, no appetite for any of the attention suddenly pointed at him. That's the moment worth sitting with for a second. A man had clearly done something wrong enough to end his career, and a huge portion of the country wanted him back anyway. That contradiction, love for the persona colliding with the reality of what the persona had actually done, is the engine that ends up driving everything that happens next. Clarkson eventually settled with Timon for £100,000 and issued a public apology, saying plainly that none of it had been Timon's fault. It barely moved the needle on how he was perceived. An apology written by lawyers and read out for cameras rarely does. The headlines had already decided what kind of man he was, and a statement wasn't going to argue them out of it. If you're the kind of person who's ever had to rebuild trust after doing something you regret, you already know the next part instinctively. Saying sorry is the easy bit. Nobody actually believes you until they watch you behave differently for a long time. Now here's where most people expect the redemption story to begin, and where it very deliberately doesn't. Within months of the sacking, Amazon signed Clarkson, May, and Hammond for a reported 9-figure deal to build the Grand Tour, launching in November 2016. It was, by any commercial measure, an enormous success. Millions of viewers in over 200 countries. Amazon even cut its subscription price to get people signed up in time for launch night. But watch closely, because this is the part that gets skipped. The Grand Tour didn't rehabilitate him. It couldn't. It was the same 3 men, the same loud opinions, the same format that had built the persona everyone was now furious at. Commercially, it printed money. Reputationally, it changed almost nothing, because nothing about the show asked him to be a different person on camera. The headlines still led with the fracas whenever his name came up. The BBC had fired the man. Amazon simply bought the brand, cold meat incident and all, and kept selling it exactly as packaged. There's something almost funny about that if you sit with it. The BBC spent 15 days investigating a producer's split lip specifically to protect its own reputation, made the difficult, principled call to let its biggest earner go, and the immediate result was handing that same earner unreformed to a rival with a bigger checkbook and none of the same appetite for scruples. The BBC did the right thing by every internal standard it had, and the market barely barely noticed. Amazon didn't need him rehabilitated, they just needed him watched. So if the Grand Tour wasn't the redemption, what was? The answer starts in 2008 with a decision so unremarkable at the time that nobody thought to write it down properly. Clarkson bought 1,000 acres of farmland near Chipping Norton, mostly as an investment, and let a local farmer carry on running it exactly as he had before. For over a decade, it wasn't a story, it was just land with his name on the deed. Then in 2019, that farm manager retired, and Clarkson, for reasons that still aren't entirely clear even to the people who worked with him, decided to try running the land himself, not as a rebrand, not as a calculated pivot away from the fracas. His own executive producer has since said plainly that unlike the Grand Tour, which was planned and deliberately wound down on its own terms, nobody actually planned this one. It simply happened, and then it kept happening because Amazon liked what the cameras were catching, and what the cameras were catching was the opposite of everything Top Gear had ever sold. Top Gear, and by extension the Grand Tour, had built an entire identity around Clarkson as the loudest, most certain man in the room, opinionated, in control, never wrong for very long, and never sorry about it. That persona is precisely what made the fracas so believable to the public, and precisely why an apology from that same persona rang so hollow. The farm demanded something that persona had never once had to offer: incompetence. On camera, repeatedly. His first potato harvest rotted. His barley failed to meet brewing standards. He got machinery stuck in his own fields on multiple occasions, in front of a crew, in front of a co-star who has never once pretended to be impressed by him. He had to ask a 20-something contractor basic questions about crops he'd owned the land for over a decade and never learned the first thing about. Viewers who'd spent years watching a man who was never wrong were suddenly watching a man who was wrong constantly and visibly rattled by it. That's not a business strategy, that's public vulnerability, and it is worth almost nothing unless the audience can tell it's real. Which brings us to the reason this actually worked, and it isn't really about Clarkson at all. It's about Kaleb Cooper, the young contractor who was already farming that land when Clarkson turned up. Kaleb has never treated him like a celebrity, doesn't perform deference for the cameras, and tells him flatly on screen when an idea is stupid. Every viewer watching that dynamic understands, without anyone explaining it, that Kaleb isn't being paid to make Clarkson look good. He's just being honest on camera about a man who happens to be famous. And that's exactly why it worked as well as it did. An apology only convinces you if it comes with proof. Kaleb, without ever intending to, became the proof. If Clarkson had been putting on an act, Kaleb would have called it out in the first 10 minutes of episode 1. He didn't, because there wasn't one to call out. Viewers weren't just watching a farmer struggle, they were watching a persona get tested, live, by someone with absolutely no reason to protect it, and pass. If you're finding this one interesting, now's the moment to subscribe, because the actual scale of the turnaround is where this gets genuinely strange. Within a few years, farming publications that would once have treated a former Top Gear presenter as a punchline were crediting him with doing more to raise public understanding of British agriculture than almost anyone else working in media. He picked up recognition from British farming organizations for advocacy on the industry's behalf. He started being taken seriously enough to weigh in publicly on farming policy, on inheritance tax reform, on the pressures facing small producers, and audiences who'd never given agriculture a second thought were suddenly listening, because the man explaining it had spent 3 years failing at it in front of them and earning their trust the hard way. Think about what that actually required. Not a statement, not a rebrand, not a carefully managed comeback interview with a friendly journalist. It required getting a tractor stuck, again, on camera, and letting people watch him be furious and embarrassed about it season after season until the fracas stopped being the first thing anyone thought of when they heard his name. The apology his lawyers wrote in 2016 barely made a dent. The apology nobody asked him to give, paid out in mud and failed harvests, and Kaleb rolling his eyes at him in real time did more for how the public sees him than any statement ever could have. That's the actual reframe worth sitting with here. This was never a business plan disguised as a documentary. Whatever money it makes along the way is a side effect, not the point. It's a public rebuild of trust, running entirely on the one currency an apology can never buy on its own: time, repetition, and enough visible failure that an audience starts to believe you're not performing anymore. You cannot apologize your way back into public trust. words are cheap, and everyone knows it. You can only fail your way back in public for long enough until people forget they were ever supposed to be angry with you. Britain has always had a soft spot for men like this. Loud, difficult, occasionally infuriating, and somehow more sympathetic the moment they're shown getting something badly wrong in front of everyone. Clarkson didn't plan his way out of that hotel car park in Yorkshire. He farmed his way out of it, one failed harvest at a time, with a 23-year-old contractor standing next to him who never once let him get away with pretending otherwise. If this gave you a different way of looking at the man behind Diddley's squat than the one you walked in with, subscribe, because there's another British story like this one already in the works, and I don't think you'll see where it ends up either. Here's the question I'd actually like an answer to. Do you think someone can genuinely earn back public trust just by being honest about failing in front of everyone for long enough? Or is it really just time doing the forgiving, and we mistake the waiting for the redemption? Leave it in the comments. I read every one of them.